Okay, I think we're good.
Except it's using your camera as opposed to that.
Oh, I need your permission to record it.
You're gonna make you the host again?
I think you can just hit, you might be able to hit record.
It's recording right now. Probably want to hit pause. Sit and deliver or stand and deliver?
If that is going on, I can stand. I was gonna sit if we were gonna use this and look at my slides. But I will, I can stand.
Right, so we're gonna toggle, let's see if we can toggle.
There we go. Okay.
I know it works.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So if I stand here, I'll be in the screen. Sarah.
Lower this all the way. Okay. That should be good.
Should be good. But perfect. How do I? Probably need to move that back.
Yeah.
Or forward.
So come on. That's as tight as we can go. Be careful we don't.
close.
If you have in case of everything else off on the side, we're gonna want to bring it in. I just don't know what the rest of your slides are.
We're good?
Is that good?
Yeah, good. Hmm.
How are you?
Hey, hey, good. How are you?
Good, good. Checking it out here.
Yeah, no, what's it, yeah. Yeah, exactly. What's happening?
We're gonna do a little talk on our mindset performance program here a little bit. So I think we'll have some people here. So you should join. Yeah. Good. Things are good. We should have. Both chairlifts going. We don't right now.
Okay.
Does it? Nice.
Never red mark your view. So. And under reluctantly,
Carter.
engaged stuff, asked for lightsaber. Sarah had no presents. I didn't. This
You may be right in the background here of the video.
Yeah.
So you could probably sneak maybe over into that window. Yeah, perfect. I would just.
Sarah was here.
Okay. So I think we're all set.
Pretty good, might be better.
Well, Mike.
Yeah.
Just
Flip that to you.
Yep.
Let's see if this is better.
All right. Good.
Or to find the right screen to share.
Yeah.
I struggle with this myself on my Mac. I don't know if you have to. Are you trying to find the right screen to share? Is that what you're trying to do?
No, I think he's just selecting the audio.
Okay.
I think we're good on the screen. Okay, let me know if you can see my slides here, John. Oh, great. Okay, perfect. Well, we're gonna get going. We've got a handful of people online. We've got a couple people here, so it'll be a nice small group. We can get going and you know, I think the nice thing about a small group is we can just ask some questions. And if you, Joey and Gardner, if you guys want to slide a little closer, you can. We've got several people on Zoom, but you can just grab those chairs right there if you like. And that way we can just kind of have a little intimate conversation. And if there's any questions that come up. And everybody out there on Zoom land, I believe, can hear us. Dave, the audio is working. Great. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming by. I know it's a busy time of year, so a lot of people have a lot of things going on, but our goal, and we've been talking about this for several months now, and our goal is finally here, and that's to give a presentation to the parents on what we're working on with the athletes in terms of mindset performance and sports psychology in general, in terms of the approach we use and some of the research behind it, so that hopefully if there's any questions at home, I know you guys certainly here in this room and probably many of you online there are pretty well adept at a lot of these concepts. But if there's any questions that come up at home, or if you see things, you know, maybe there's a way you can kind of, you know, gently direct in the direction we're all trying to go. So if that sounds good to everybody, we'll get going. Just to give you a little bit of background on how we've arrived at this program. Much like Gardner, I was an Alpine coach here years ago and became pretty interested in the psychology side or the mental side. And so in 2006, had the opportunity to go back to graduate school at University of Utah and study sports psych, and really had a lot of questions going into that process after having been a coach and also playing professional golf for a number of years, teaching and coaching professional golf. And I came out of grad school with probably 3 times as many questions, but certainly a bit more of a roadmap in terms of kind of where to direct people. And my approach from a practical standpoint, from a practicing standpoint, is 4-parted. And that's what I'm going to go over with you tonight. And it's really the 4 parts, central parts of our program. So when the athletes pull up the program, show you what it looks like here. They see this page. And so there's 4 primary parts. We're going to talk about 2 specifically tonight. But the first part is what we call energy management, and has a lot to do with focus and concentration. Second part is imagery, and that has a lot to do with the brain-body connection, how the brain learns. This is an area I'm really fascinated in and spent a lot of time researching myself and looking into different ways of applying some of the research that's out there. The third part is motivation and how we manage that as athletes, coaches, and parents. And then the fourth part is the zone, or finding flow. And that's based on some research that was done in the 80s and 90s. Probably have heard of a guy named Michele Csikszentmihalyi, who did kind of the pioneering research in and around flow and finding flow. So we're going to talk tonight specifically about energy management, focus and concentration, and imagery. And this is really over the last couple months that we've been focusing on with the athletes. So I'll show you how they get into using some of these tools. But before we do that, I'll just show you a little bit of the research that's behind this.
Is there a link on the website?
Yes.
I just shared it in the chat. I just shared it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, and so it is shared in the chat. So the athletes, we use a platform called Teachable. When you log in, it just asks for an email and a password. It's a free admission. There's no price or anything like that. Once you create your login and username, then you just keep logging back in with that. And it's quite easy to use from the phone as well. Right. Slides here. Hang on one sec. I'm going to stop sharing for one moment so I can see my tab. There we go. And we'll go back to share here. We think like 3 years ago, if you were a visitor to what we're doing right now, be like, what's going on? What are these guys doing? We've just become so used to Zoom and sharing. Okay, so I really introduced this topic of energy management in and around having a calm mind and a calm body. And really the overview I give for the athletes is we talk about the way the nervous system works and the way it's balanced. And we have two sides, and you guys are all, I'm sure, very aware of this through, as adults, we talk and hear about this all the time, but we have sympathetic side of our nervous system and the parasympathetic side. As athletes, that sympathetic side, which is the fight or flight response, which triggers adrenaline, cortisol, and some of those feelings of nerves, energy that we get before events. That is stress, that is competition stress and training stress. And we experience that on a daily basis. The side that balances that out is that parasympathetic side. We often refer to that as the rest and digest. So that triggers more neurochemicals involved with dopamine, serotonin. It's more of the relaxing, recovering way that we feel. So there's not necessarily a time, or we don't want to look at these as opposing all the time. We want to spend some time in one and some time in the other. And when we get to events, what I talk about a lot with the athletes is that we want that good response from the sympathetic side of our nervous system. We want that good adrenaline. We want that rush of energy and that feeling of being at a big event. That's going to help us get more out of what we have. And so to simplifying this discussion is difficult, but the way that we do it is we talk about my mouse here. Here we go. We talk about using breath as a way to regulate, right? So diaphragmatic nasal breathing is the quickest way to activate the parasympathetic side of our nervous system, or the rest and digest. So what we talk about a lot with the athletes is we want to spend as much time in that space as we can, certainly when we're not training and when we're not competing, so that when we do get to those competitive events, we can have the response, we can get the good stuff from that sympathetic response. Some of the benefits we talk about, as I said earlier, releases endorphins and serotonin, increases energy and blood flow, decreases inflammation and cortisol, and stimulates that lymphatic system, which is, we're finding research is suggesting that is so key in recovery, especially for endurance sports athletes. It's not necessarily the amount of rest we get, but it's the quality of the recovery that we get. And so when we work with the endurance side, the Nordic combiners and the cross country guys, specifically right after a stressful training day, we want to use some of these techniques to activate that parasympathetic. There's actually some research that's showing now it's increasing your ability to tap into diaphragmatic nasal breathing is increasing your body's ability to tolerate stress. We share a little bit of research with the athletes. Probably the one I like to share with them that kind of gets their attention is in and around long-time meditators. So when we look at Buddhist monks and people that are long-time, lifelong meditators, they actually have some structural differences in the way their DNA is composed. And specifically what we see are these telomeres, which are indicators of aging. In long-time meditators, often those telomeres will be longer. So literally we're reversing the aging process when we consistently activate that parasympathetic side of our nervous system. So what are some techniques we use? And I'll show you these in the program here. We use basic concentration and focus, which is breath counting through diaphragmatic nasal breathing. We use a very basic guided meditation. There's no spiritual or religious slant on this. It's just very straightforward. It's a way of just harnessing the breath, staying aware of one's thoughts. Progressive relaxation is probably the one I use the most with the athletes. That is a way of accelerating the recovery process through consciously contracting and relaxing with nasal diaphragmatic breathing in between that process. So we start at the feet, we work our way up to the head, and it's just a conscious contraction, release, breath, contraction, release, breath. And then the last one that we use a lot with the athletes is box breathing. So box breathing, I'll show you here in a minute. But all of these in and around this idea of diaphragmatic nasal breathing. So what's the connection to performance, right? Really the theme that we use with energy management is we're trying to get athletes more in their body. So when we'll talk a little bit more about imagery here in a minute, the tendency that we see with sports psychology in athletes that don't perform at their peak is they're generally more in their thoughts. Their thoughts are more internal. They're more in their self-perceptive side of their brain. And they're not as much in their body. And we can think about this, right? When we've had, as athletes growing up, when we had good performances, what do we always used to say? I didn't think about much, right? It just kind of happened. Well, that's not necessarily an accident. There's actual evidence that suggests the more we can be present in our body and more feeling and externally aware of our surroundings, the more automated the process can become. So we really drive that point home. So in a perfect world, and I kind of alluded to this a minute ago, we would spend as athletes as much time as we can in that rest and digest state, in that parasympathetic state, right? So we would wake up, we would do some form of concentration or meditation, and we would try to lengthen that throughout the day. When we get to training, we know that that sympathetic side is going to get activated, and we want to be able to respond to that, right? We want to be able to manage how much of that takes over our thoughts and bodies. And then when we get into events, competitions, and races, it ramps up even more, right? So we want to be able to be aware of what's happening and be able to respond to it and be able to regulate with our nasal breathing and with our focus and concentration tools. So I always like to ask the athletes, why is it that in the Olympics, world records are almost always broken? Why aren't they broken at home events? Like, so if we're looking at a track and field athlete, why isn't the 400 always broken at, random regional meet? There's no quote unquote pressure. It's because when we get on those big stages and we get that sympathetic side of our nervous system activated, we get more adrenaline, right? We get more energy. We have a little bit more energy to utilize our skills and make the most out of what we have. So as we get it further on into the program, what we're trying to do is show them that competition stress is a good thing, right? It's an opportunity. We can actually perform better in those environments if managed appropriately, right? So what are some of the tools that we use for that? Go back up here. Go back to our program here. So they've got a progressive relaxation podcast here. So when they click on that, it's about 5 minutes and it's me taking them through that process. And they've done that with me in Olympian Hall or, in the locker room or weight room or something at some point. So I've given them that script in person. And they can just do this right from their phone, plug their headphones right into it. In terms of focus and concentration, we've got a basic concentration. Basic concentration. Hang on. That link's not working right. There we go. All right, so here's our basic concentration, takes them through. And then once they've done that, got pretty comfortable with that. This is really just breath counting exercise. And they go into guided meditation and they go through that. It's a little bit longer. You can see this one's a little over 7 minutes. And then the last one, and we do this a lot on the hill or outside. And this is a box breathing technique that really gets them into their body as they're doing it, right? So it's a way of, once they've gotten comfortable with this diaphragmatic nasal breathing, then we actually have them physically trace a box on their diaphragm as they're breathing with their right index finger. It's a way of grounding them. So we talk about trying to get inhales and exhales to match about 6 seconds each. So we're inhaling in for 6 as we draw a line, and we're holding for 6, and then we're exhaling for 6, and then we're holding for 6. So it's a way of kind of physically grounding them in their body. This is a great thing for them to do at the top of starts, or the top of the fence.
Is there an age appropriate, for instance, I think you're doing this for U14 and above, is that?
Yeah.
Those are
Yeah.
too much for the younger ones to comprehend perhaps?
U14s, we really focus on the box breathing in this part of the program and the progressive relaxation. So we try to keep it more physically oriented. The basic concentration, the guided meditation is a little tougher it's a little more abstract for that group, but the actual physical exercises of the box breathing and the progressive relaxation where they're tightening and relaxing their muscles, I think they can grasp onto that a little bit easier. Right. So generally, almost always when we get groups in here and we run them through this, it's amazing how the energy in the room changes, right? They come in, it's kind of bounced off the walls. And oftentimes I'll give them a concentration grid exercise. So we'll go through and it's a way for them to kind of test their concentration. It's a bunch of numbers randomized on a sheet, and I'll ask them to find 1 through 10. And I'll have them do it before we actually go through this exercise. So they'll go through it and then we'll do the exercise and then we'll do it again. And almost always there's comments to, the effect of it's a little easier, a little less stressful to do it after I've gone through that exercise. So we try to kind of physically connect it to them. You got a Christmas present for me? Yeah, you're good. No problem. Okay, we've got some folks on Zoom, so jump in whenever you're ready. Okay, so I'm going to back out of this. Any questions on that idea of energy management, focus and concentration, or any of those tools that we give them? When we look at sports psychology, there is a sequence of mindset performance tools. And the foundation work, the focus and concentration work is always the first step. If we can't get there, if we can't get to a place where we can actually slow down, calm the mind, calm the body, find some space, then we can't get into imagery. It's difficult to get into some of the motivation concepts we talk about, and it's really hard to get into flow. So this is step one, the most important. And unfortunately, it's kind of it's the least glamorous of all of them, right? So some of the kids are like, oh gosh, here we go, nasal breathing again. I'm like, just consistency daily, make it a habit.
Is the coaching staff incorporating this into starting training or anything like that?
Yeah.
Things like that?
Yeah. Some more than others, depending on their environment. But over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in coaches using this. Sadie's actually strength coach has been using it a little bit, prior to her sessions and after their sessions, especially on the recovery side. But I think we're really starting to get some good energy around this. We started this 3 years ago. We had a good start, and then COVID hit. And last year I was in a mask, and kids didn't really we were outside. So we're really ramping this up again. I think we're getting some good traction with a lot of the groups. Okay, so we're going to shift to part 2, which is imagery. And this is, for me, I think the most fascinating. And what I often do with the athletes to start when we talk about imagery is I share with them a story. And we've all probably had a story about how imagery has helped us at some point. But my story as a ski racer had to do with just leading into a summer camp in Mount Hood. And I was, I'll kind of give you the cliff notes, but I was like 15 years old, had a summer job that was incredibly boring. And I spent a couple weeks leading into a summer camp just in the back room of this lumberyard, sorting boards and thinking about ski racing. And I sort of stumbled into this way of seeing myself ski race that was different from the way I had prior to any season, or training or race that I'd ever been to. I go to this summer camp, first run, first day, Palmer Glacier. I still remember it was crystal clear. And I kind of build this story up for them so they're somewhat engaged. But I had this, unbelievable experience in the first 6 skates, was skiing in a fashion I'd never skied before. And started going extremely fast, faster than I ever had before. And of course, the minute I recognized how fast I was going and thought to myself, wow, I'm going really fast, I promptly crashed, right? Blew out of the course. Put my skis on, I skied down to my coach, and my coach was like, "What? That was amazing. What have you been doing?" I was like, I he's like, have you been skiing? Did you go to a camp in Austria that I didn't know about? And I'm like, no, I've been working. And I didn't say anything about what happened, but it kind of spooked me. And it startled me into sort of thinking about, well, how does imagery, how does thinking about improving at a sport actually help you? And it wasn't until years later in graduate school that I figured out kind of what I was onto and what the answer was. So really, when we talk about imagery, we're talking about how the brain learns. So when we talk about imagery with the athlete, we start with just talking about neural connectivity. And neural connectivity is basically the opposite of muscle memory. So we ask them to think about this idea of muscle memory and promptly throw it right out the window. All of our motor patterns and motor learning is a function of the neural circuitry in our brain, which then signals down our spinal cord into our muscles. So if we can think about repetition from a neural circuitry standpoint, we can actually improve and enhance the learning process, right? Volume is important. Physical volume, obviously, we're not going to replace that, but we can enhance it.
Luke, are you meaning to share this on?
Thank you, sir. Let's do this one. Okay, should be able to see that now. Okay, so in terms of neural pathways, we talk about the process of consciously learning a new pattern. And we talk about cues, so internal and external cues. So the example I like to give the athletes is when we learn how, some of them don't drive, but I often use the example of driving to start. So when we learn how to drive or we learn how to ride a bike, right? The first couple times, there is conscious thought about how to do that, right? We think about where to put our hands. We have to think about where the gas pedal is. We have to think about maybe where the blinker is. It's a very conscious driven response. Once those motor patterns are formed, and driving a car is a very simple motor pattern. It's not nearly as complex as what we're doing out here on the hill. But once those motor patterns are generally formed, the brain and the body respond best to external cues. So an external cue is simply, where do we want to go, right? I want to drive on the road. I'm going to look at the road. Once that motor pattern's formed, my leg reaches for the gas pedal, my foot touches it without much conscious thought, right? In fact, if I look at the ditch, generally what's going to happen is I'm going to drive into the ditch, right? So we talk about this because what happens as we start to develop as an athlete is that we start to really get into a confusing time of blending these two cues together, internal and external cues. And what the research suggests is that an external focus when performing is across the board a better focus to have. An internal focus when learning, when working on a new skill, is often a better focus to have. But it's important that we don't confuse the two, right? So it's important that if we're going to a race or we're going to an event, we've done all this training and we know that our skills are solid, that we don't get in the start and start to walk ourselves through step by step how to ski down the hill, right? We've got to pick a cue like strong, fast, or we've got to look at where we want to go, or we've got to have some sort of feedback in terms of the cue that we're going to use. Like, where do we want to feel the pressure in our ski? Where do we want to feel our boot? So what I like to do is take the athletes through a worksheet. I'll show you this here. Let's see out here. Too many tabs open. So they have a focus of attention worksheet. And we'll ask them, and we'll walk through sort of what some of the skills that they're working on and what's an internal or a descriptive how to do something way of thinking of it is, and what's an external or what's the physical feedback of the outcome, right? So an example of this would be like with the cross-country skiers. let's say the skill they're working on is getting more power in their pull plan, right? So a way of talking about that you might hear is, hey, you need to get more force, right? You need more power in your pull plan, right? You need to get your arms up higher, you get your pulls into the ground, more force. It's a descriptive way of describing the process, right? An external cue would be, and one that the Nordic coaches here are really good at using, is hang on your pulls, right? So that's a task. Hang on your pulls when you plan, right? It's the same outcome, right? We're getting to the same place, but the brain is a task master. If you get a simple task like that, it's going to respond faster with a better response time. In fact, the research shows if you have an internal cue and you're an athlete, you're thinking about sort of how to do something, and you're walking yourself through how to describe it, the side of our brain that's associated with self-perception and judgment gets activated. So all of a sudden, not only are we slowing the response and the reaction time down, but now it's a judgment game. Am I doing it right? Right? As opposed to when we think about some of our best performances, it's generally automated and it's reactive to the situation. So we don't get this complex with the athletes, but we do try to get them to drill down and simplify external cues in very 1 or 2 words. And then internal cues is, how would you describe it to yourself? Like, how would you walk yourself through that process if you hadn't done it before? And it's okay to use that internal cue when we're training, when we're learning, when we're working on skill development. But ultimately, we want to get to an external cue that's more accessible under stress and performance or competition. And that's easier for those athletes to lean on when they get to those events. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So the last part of this is we talk about block training, random training, and situational training. So far too often we see a lot of athletes kind of get stuck in this block training pattern where they're just run after run after run after run after run after run. And that's okay, especially if we're working on a new skill, right? If we're working on a drill. But what we want to do and what the research says is that learning accelerates when we can rotate through these 3 environments. So we can have some block training, maybe we do some drills for a few runs, and then we have some random training, right? I go ski a course or I go ski a different run. And then we go into some situational training, which would be maybe using a timer, right? Or having a race course that I'm going to run a few times and actually run through that process. Go back here to this. So the research around this is called action effect hypothesis. And again, we kind of come back to getting into your body and less in your head. As I talked about a minute, that's internal focus triggers that neural activity that's associated with self-perception and often slows down response times. That external focus has a lot to do with the automated process that works in those motor patterns and letting those fire and respond a little faster.
Can you give a quick example of an internal focus versus external?
Sure. So that one I used a minute ago was more cross-country oriented. So maybe I can use one that would be related to, let's use one that's related to jumping, right? So if I'm a jumper and I'm thinking about the skill of trying to get more energy in the takeoff, right? So one thing that they might talk about would be in their progression would be, feeling or having the sense that their hips are up, right? They're not kind of sitting back and being passive in the jump, that they're really exploding through the jump. And so that would be an internal way of describing it, right? So an external focus, and I'm going to get to this here in a minute, are really probably the most reliable external focuses are images. So if they can have clear images of what that looks like, so them on video or someone else on video, and really committing to that image, that will allow that automated process to happen faster, right? Or if they can use a keyword that is like strong or fast or quick, that's less descriptive, but more kind of tends to the feel that they have when that happens, that's more of an external focus. So images are really the best are really the best forms of external focus. All right, so let's get my mouse here, a couple screens. So some of the research on action effect hypothesis, a lot of it started with golfers actually. And so they gave them internal focus of focusing on the hinging of their wrists, right? So describing the technique to them and saying, hey, this is where you would want your wrist to hinge for this particular technique to be successful. And then they gave them external nearby and external distal. So they said, hey, just focus on a square face, right? That's the effect of the movement. And then they've had just focus on a straight flight or focus on the target. Those are external focuses. So for an alpine ski racer, focusing on where do I want that turn to be? Where do I want my ski relative to the gate? That's my focus. That would be an external focus. Group 3, external distal, across the board in 25 years of research is always more accurate and performs better. And they've done this with beginners, intermediate, and expert groups across a whole genre of sports. The bottom line is that external focus seems to allow for the automatic process to happen easier in the brain. So summary, we just really talk about the idea of using clear cues, have the athletes kind of define specifically what they're working on prior to training is really important. I see a lot of athletes that kind of ping pong. I'm going to try this for a while. I'm going to try this for a while. And their coaches are giving them clear feedback and cues to use, but they're like, maybe I'll try this over here. I haven't tried this before. So before training, what am I working on? How am I getting it better? And how am I going to measure that? So we give them this worksheet somewhere here. That really just asks them to drill down into what aspects and what skills they're working on a daily basis. Along with that, in this program, we have a podcast that describes for them and walks them through shifting between internal and external focus of attention. And we have a couple more podcasts that get into just basic imagery and sports specific imagery. So as we start this imagery process with the athletes, we start with just basic images around their house, both associative and disassociative, so in their body and out of their body. And then we have them shift into more complex sports specific imagery. And the whole idea is that we would want to go home and be able to relive 2 or 3 good runs from training and really key on what those feels were and what those cues were that helped us, and just augment and further deepen those patterns in the brain. Lastly, any questions on that? Any questions out there in Zoom? I haven't been monitoring the chat, but Dave, have you seen any Zoom questions? We typically will run them through, when we introduce imagery, we'll run them through these scripts. And then we'll also run them through an example of how internal images and external images work. I don't do it quite as much with the U14. I don't get as in depth with them, but the U16 and up, we give them some examples and give them a sense of feeling how this plays out with some simple motor patterns. And I think that seems to be pretty effective. Actually do some things indoors.
How does this transition from training and doing work inside and stuff like that to actually performing in competition?
Yeah. So one of the things
I
we
don't think how we don't want the internal external in a competition. We want that clear line.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so what we talk about is when it comes to competition and when it comes to racing and competing and all these things, the research is pretty clear that performance is enhanced with external cues. The research also shows that when you have an athlete that's maybe high on the ego, scale, low on the task scale or mastery scale, and uses an internal focus of attention, that's typically the formula that leads to a collapse or a choke, quote unquote choke. Now, we don't tell them that. I want to plant that seed in their brain. But what I like to do is really encourage them to focus in training on what are the cues in the weeks leading up to a race or an event that have been working for you in training. What are the what's the feedback that you get from those cues? And how can you simplify and make those cues easier to remember under stress? Right. So we're in the top of the start, and we know that we have a couple cues that have been working for us in training, and I want to get into my body, right? Out of my mind, into my body, and I want to feel those cues. What's a word that'll help me do that? It might be strong. It might be high, right? In terms of turn shape. It might be quick, right? In terms of cross-country skier. It might be light feet, right? Thinking about something like, so simplifying it and then committing to it, right? Because my feeling through all of this stuff is that, and the research is a little inconclusive on this, but cues come and go, right? And things that help us come and go. And over time, the helpfulness of a cue can tend to fade away. And my feeling on that through my experience in working with athletes is that it's because it becomes more descriptive over time and the athletes don't believe it as much, right? So if we can feel it more and commit to it, it will continue to help us. But if it becomes more of a thought, like I do this, I say this to myself, and I hope it works this time, I'm not as committed to it, it's not as helpful. But if it's more of a feel, more of an external cue, and I'm committed to it, I believe in it, that automated process can then kick in and I can perform, where I should. That makes sense? So in terms of leading into a race, that's a great question. The last couple tools that are in this platform for the athletes on imagery is we have a race plan here. And it's not going to let me show this here, so I'm going to pull it up on the Google Doc. Okay. So leading into an event, what's the realistic outcome that we're seeking today? My experience in working with athletes, and I don't tell them this directly, but generally our best performance that we've ever had is kind of how we identify with ourselves as a good athlete. And our worst performance we've ever had is how we identify ourselves as a bad athlete. 80% of our performances are somewhere in the middle, right? But a lot of athletes are going into races thinking, I got to get that one time, that 10%, right? But what's a realistic outcome? If I've been finishing consistently in the top 20, then that's probably a realistic outcome to say, hey, I want to finish in the top 15, right? Not I want to finish in the top 5 like I did that one time. So I use the term realistic because I want the athletes to be honest with themselves in terms of what's an attainable goal for today, right? What's something that's within my wheelhouse, just hard enough, right? Not too easy, but it's not out of reach. Then how are you going to get the most out of the ability? What cues have you been using in training in the last couple of weeks leading up to this that have been helpful? How am I going to commit to those? And then why do we compete? And this gets a little bit more into the motivation section that we'll talk about later next month when we do this. But what's sort of that why, right? The what's and the hows are easy. Everybody can talk about what they want and how they're going to get it. But until you can define why you want it, that lasting motivation is always going to be tough to pin down. So then we drill down even more. What times it start? What time are you going to wake up? What's your nutrition plan? What's your plan for your equipment? And the message I like to deliver to the athletes is, remember when we were talking about that side of our nervous system that we want to have that fight or flight response, that activation of the sympathetic when we're in the start. Well, if we wake up in the morning, we're unorganized and that response takes off, guess what? I'm not going to respond as well to it when it happens at the start. I'm already starting to exhaust some of my nervous system energy. So if I can plan everything out, we talk about, the idea of if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, down to what time am I going to arrive? What time do I want to go up to the start? What's the cue I'm going to use? What's my plan? And then what's my reframing technique? And reframing techniques we get into in flow, but essentially it's a form of self-talk. So as things start to go off the rails for me for self-talk, I've got a tool that I can use, which is recognize, relax, and reframe. And we get into that later with them. And then we've got sort of a wrap up, right? After the event. I think this is probably the most critical part, is actually going through, because this is going to set up your training after the event in terms of your imagery, in terms of the cues that you're going to use. You know, what did you learn? What did you improve upon? And I actually I've been recently using the idea of how did you learn, not what did you learn? And what did you feel, not how did you feel? So if you listen to a lot of the kind of vernacular around the bottom of starts, it's how did it feel? You know, what did you learn? Those are all good questions. But the minute you ask a kid how it felt, they instantly go into good or bad. Did I succeed or fail? But if you ask him what they felt, well, that could be interesting. Let's get curious about that, right? And then how did you learn? And the idea behind that is, you know, learning is difficult, and learning is challenging, and it hurts, and it's painful, and sometimes it's not fun. And if they can start to grasp around that idea as an athlete, then they can start to approach training a little differently, right? Learning is not a static activity. It's very active. And I think that there's a tendency, a lot of athletes that I work with, there's a tendency for them to believe that being good at something and learning feels easy. That's not the case at all. So what we're trying to ask them to do is just sort of shift to say, you know what, that felt pretty bad. Something good might have happened there, right?
Which goes back to that fixed growth mindset to
Right.
the tendency to go with like, no, I know what I do that works. I'm not going to change it. I keep doing that. And you're going to grow. You're
Right.
going to be better. If this is a template for maybe examining that.
Exactly. Right. And so then that's a segue as we get into the third part of the program, which we'll talk about next month with flow and motivation. And what Dave just said, we talk a lot about achievement goal theory, attribution theory, and those kinds of things, those kind of central concepts to being a mastery oriented athlete, that if they can get now, it's just like so beneficial in the long run. It just exponentially improves that growth process and learning process. So I know that's a lot to throw in one session, but I want to make sure we answer any questions, and I want to go back and kind of show you again, just kind of summarize what the athlete will see when they look at this. So as I'm pulling that up, does anybody have any questions, or are there any questions on Zoom?
So every athlete has this link and they can.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
What's it called?
SSWSC Mindset Performance Program. Yep. And we have a lot of athletes that ask about Calm and Headspace, which I think are great apps. You guys maybe have used those or had your kids use them at some point. And I highly encourage the use of those, because I think that they're just professionally done, you know, well presented audio scripts for activating that parasympathetic side of our nervous system. And the only word of caution I would use with those is that there is a tendency to get a little dependent on them. I don't think that this stuff is necessarily rocket science. And once the athletes get a feel for kind of what works for them, the best form really is to go in a quiet room and do it on your own and not have that external audio walking you through it. So once they can get these skills down and like, okay, I need to go concentrate, I'm gonna go do some box breathing. I'm gonna find a quiet spot and I'm gonna do it. I don't need a phone. I don't need headphones to do it. I can just do it. Or I'm going to go do progressive relaxation, or I'm going to use Calm and Headspace, and I'm going to use some sort of, you know, sleep podcast to help me relax and go to sleep. That's fine, but let's not get overly dependent on it. Let's be able to do that kind of on our own without the need of technology. The last one I'll talk a little bit about is this imagery script. I mentioned it, but when we talk about sports specific imagery, This is one thing I'm talking a lot about with the groups currently right now, especially in this last week. As they're leaving training, I like this idea of stacking firewood. And some people will say it's you're essentially recalling good events, or you're focusing on the positives, right? But I like this idea of stacking firewood because it's a way of building ourselves some reserves for when the going gets tough. So when we get into events and we get into the competition season, as we lead up to the event, that's typically when the most fear and the most self-doubt, and so the questioning starts to happen. And if we can have a tool that we can use, and the tool that we have here in this podcast is to just go back and simply relive and recount, what are the 2 things you did well in training, right? What were the things that went right? What were the challenges that you overcame? And just consistently remind ourselves of those. Then when we get into those events, when that fear and that self-doubt, maybe a little bit of anxiety kicks in, we can go back and we can recall, what are some of the good things I've been doing? How did I get here, right? It's just a very simple reframing technique. Far too often, especially with the adolescent athlete, they're so fixated on what they're missing and what they are doing wrong that they lose sight of what they've been doing well, right? And what they've been doing right. And when you're around, and you guys have probably experienced this in your coaching experience, when you're around really elite athletes, there can be what seems sometimes like a sense of arrogance. And it's really not arrogance as much as it is self-belief and self-efficacy, right? They know they've done things to get to this point. They're not looking outside for any confirmation of that. They're always reminding themselves of what they did well. And when we get into the motivation part of the program, we talk about this in terms of attribution theory, which has been researched for the last 30 years. It's really cool stuff. What do great athletes attribute their successes and failures to? Well, there's 3 things we can talk about. We can talk about ability, we can talk about effort, or we can talk about luck. And really elite athletes never, ever, ever fault their ability. And that's what gets confused with arrogance, right? They always look to effort first. Did I prepare? Did I give effort? If I did and it didn't go my way, bad luck. It wasn't my fault. And you can kind of pick up on this sometimes when you listen to interviews, but what I see a lot with athletes, what's the first thing they come, young adolescent athletes out here, oftentimes when they come down, they have a bad run. It's the first thing they say. I suck, right? It's faulting ability. Can't do that. So if we can use this podcast, Stack Firewood, out of training, it starts to snowball. They start to get that belief, that self-belief, and they start to work more towards this idea that, hey, I can change outcomes with my effort. I can change ability with my effort, but I don't suck.
On the flip side, what about you had mentioned it before, the overconfidence and arrogance?
Yeah, so when we look at achievement goal theory, which Dave was talking about a minute ago, that's that growth fixed mindset, right? It came out of Carol Dweck's research at Stanford. And if you have, generally we all have a certain amount of ego orientation and we have a certain amount of task orientation. So if you have an athlete that has more ego orientation than task orientation, that's where we can run into some problems from a motivation standpoint, right? But generally what we see with elite level athletes is they have really high task orientations, but they also have really high ego orientations. They have a lot of self-belief. So we just want to make sure that they're balanced. That's the key. And we have some tools in that motivation platform to help with that as well. So we're about 5 minutes from 6. Any other questions that we can answer? I think we've talked about a little bit in terms of how as parents, and I have two kids, one that's starting to get into that adolescent age and competing, and how to kind of help them with some of this stuff. And I think from my standpoint, what I see the biggest thing we can do is just try to provide as many environments to activate that parasympathetic side of the nervous system as possible. And from my experience, a lot of that has to do with devices. Unfortunately, I think these things are way too invasive. And There's actually research coming out in and around blue light now that's saying that it turns out it's probably not the best thing, particularly first thing in the morning. There's some research suggesting that that blue light actually kills the production of melatonin if that's the first thing that our brain takes in. We actually want that natural light to start to create that process of melatonin, which helps that whole cycle of going to bed, right? And having a good night's sleep. So if we're robbing that in the morning, first thing, we're kind of sabotaging what's going to happen later that day. I think this is stuff we all know, but it's just hard. I know I struggle with this as a parent. Like sometimes you're making dinner. It's just easy to be like, you know what, just turn on a show. I don't care. Your kids over there texting, you're like, well, at least they don't need anything right now, So I think that's the biggest thing. I think it's just continually trying to make sure those environments are possible. Right. And then in terms of the imagery side of things, I think the coaches here, my experience with all the coaches in the club is they are so good at this stuff already. They're cued into what cues work best for which athletes. But I think that specificity in, what did you feel today and how did you learn? I think those are the questions that really you can kind of maybe tee up for athletes and start to get them to think about that process of trying to get more in their body, less in their head, and trying to get more physically present with the whole process and engaging that learning with curiosity, right? And with, oh, it's challenging, that's good, right? I'm going to make a breakthrough here if it feels hard. So I'll stop talking. Any questions out there? Cool. So let me know if you have any issues with that link, but it's a good resource. It's a good tool. You can work through those podcasts on your own, check them out. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to help.
One more question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, in my own mind, differentiate between too much in the mind and getting more into the body.
Mhm.
I guess that's the internal versus the external.
Yep.
When we were coming up, we were taught visualization, right? Visualize. So that's all in the mind, right?
Mhm.
So I'm trying to figure out how and when things changed. A little bit more about the exercises to get into your body.
Yeah. Well, it hasn't changed. And I know that's a great question because it can be difficult sometimes to kind of flesh out. And I can sometimes struggle to explain this myself, but imagery or visualization is a form of an external cue. So if we have an image of what we want to happen, that's an external cue, right? But we're not describing to ourselves with words how to do it step by step. That would be internal, right? And it's really, I think it's micro and it's macro. So on the micro level, when we're talking about skill development and training, having that video feedback of what we want to do from a skill standpoint is really helpful. Having that picture, right, and committing to that picture will expedite that learning process. It's a great external cue. On a macro level, having a picture of what we want in 2, 3, 5 years from now, how we want to be in 2, 3, 5 years from now. It's the same process that's taking place, right? The brain is going to start to self-organize itself towards that image. And conversely, if we have an image that's negative, if we're always kind of skiing away from what we don't want, guess what? We're going to drive in the ditch. We're going to go more towards what we don't want. Right. So I talk a lot about throughout the whole process with athletes, like skiing toward opportunity, skiing toward what you want, not away from what you don't want. Right. Define clearly how you want to be, define clearly what it is you want out of the sport and ski toward that as opposed to away from what you don't. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Let me know if you have any questions. Here's a resource. I'm here most days on the hill as we start to get more open on Mount Warner. I'll be over there with the athletes training over there. And a lot of what I do, once we walk them through these sessions, I like to have a follow-up where I'm just there. And I'm not necessarily offering much in the form of information. I'm just there as a resource. And that's when an athlete will kind of ski up and ask a question. And oftentimes that's, when the good stuff happens, right? Yeah.
Follow up with a second presentation for parents as well.
Yep. So in January, we'll go over motivation and flow and kind of show you what we work on with the athletes. And that's a little bit more of the glamorous stuff, especially the flow stuff. It's cool talking about the zone, how we get in the zone, how we access it, where the door is, where the key is, all that good stuff. But in terms of the sequence, we start with these two, and then we'll start giving the athletes in January after the break, the motivation and flow tools and working them through those. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming on Zoom as well. It's just fun to talk about,
I had no idea you were going this